tying into this idea of how much capacity is there for shellfish to grow. Brett will talk a little bit about how that capacity might actually change from year to year because the environment, surprise, isn't constant all the time. So, Brett, thanks.
Okay, and I will present some of that data that is still being collected at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife lab there in the car. All right, so I'm actually going to give some just general background about oysters. It's on the one handout that Jim mentioned, which is just who we, because maybe some of the audience, hopefully everyone here knows, but we had a native oyster here, and we still have a native oyster here, Austria lurida. So I'm just going to give some really quick background, really fast, and then we introduced the Pacific oyster from Japan. And I'm going to talk mostly about the Pacific oyster and not the native oyster, but we should keep that in mind. And so this is sort of a spatial and temporal framework. I think it's important context anyhow for Willapa if we build some of these carrying capacity models, which would be is probably a nice need. So this represents a map of native oysters in the 1800s. One of the useful sort of things. It's somewhat crude, but it's still useful on the scale of the whole bay and where native oysters were historically. From the Collins 1888 survey, they covered about 22.7% of the tide flat. That's a little low. I think Brady Blake has some revisions. I apologize for not having those from his paper. And then most of the current aquaculture areas for Crest Austria gigas Pacific oyster overlap areas where natives were present, but often occur at higher intertidal elevation than areas where any remaining natives survive, and cover about 10% of that intertidal tide flat. And then we're going to get into talking about it. Well, we've talked a little bit already about eelgrass. So eelgrass covers about 32% of the tide flat, and actually has a significant overlap with that eelgrass. And so this is a picture of across from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife lab where I worked. Well, the one on the left there. I'm not sure I can work this thing. Anyway, that's my technician Lee McCoy that used to work for me, where native oysters used to be and is now solid eelgrass, but clearly had lots more native oysters in the past. So I think that's an important temporal reference.
Yeah, I think it's getting a lot of rattle because it's because the stand shaking. I think that'll help.
So if I don't lean on the stand, maybe.
There you go. All that together should work.
Sorry about that. Okay. And finally, I want to point out that shellfish growers have recognized patterns in oyster growth and condition at this scale for a long time. And there's a really important work on, still doing it?
Winter? You were looking for the winter.
Yeah. Okay. There's a line that's been recognized for a long time. So growers have recognized that for a long time, and they use these beds primarily for juvenile oysters and seed down at this end of the bay, and plant, the best, most productive ground is up here near the north end of the bay, north of the stacking line. And so we'll see if the science can tell us why that is, even though the growers have known it for a long time. More about context for the Pacific Northwest and for Willapa and Grace Harbor is sort of just general nearshore coastal oceanography, and the fact that it actually dictates what goes on in the estuary where the oysters are grown. So in the Pacific Northwest, we have late spring and summer fair weather and strong upwelling off the coast, and the flow in general, at least further offshore, is to the south and offshore. And that upwelling water comes into the estuary, but only during reversals, which are fairly frequent actually in the summer months during fair weather. And in the fall and winter, we have storms and reversals all the time. And so the Columbia River, this plume can actually make it fresher in the winter at the mouth of the estuary than it is further up the estuary. And that's changed. Columbia River flow has changed too historically. And so some more context is that estuary conditions then reflect the nearshore coastal ocean, especially during the productive summer months when those reversals occur. And in both Graves Harbor and Willapa Bay, this is temperature on this axis, and the offshore station is represented by one of these lines, and the temperature fluctuates the same offshore as it does inshore. And then and this is the offshore wind. It goes the same way. And I'm going to skip this slide actually, because Jennifer is going to talk about this more, but it's important. So tides and shallow bathymetry in Willapa Bay are really important as well. They have consequences for what Thomas talked about as well, and that is how long is that water in the bay, and so how often is that phytoplankton recirculated to the bivalves. And so we have really long residence time south end of the bay and shorter on the mouth of the bay. And so Neil Bannis and Jennifer and others have looked at that scale, and that is reflected in temperature as well. So that temperature is colder up here near the mouth and warmer down here in this end of the bay, perhaps not surprisingly. And it takes a while for that water to get down to that end of the bay, and a lot of the phytoplankton that's food here is measured as chlorophyll, comes in from the coastal ocean during the productive summer months that oysters are there. So this is also in the handout, since it's just basic oyster life history that most everybody here knows. And that is oysters have larvae, and a lot of that, at least for oyster production, now occurs in hatcheries, and I'm not going to talk about that, although we do have a lot of information on that. And then oyster spat on shell here, and then oyster seed here on a long line. But I'm going to talk about experiments where I'm going to call this seed. They are spat at one point and then develop into a bolder seed. And of course, mature oysters, and we've seen pictures of this as well. So very fast, ground culture, long line culture, and we now have foot bag culture as well. And then just oysters as they would naturally grow on the bottom in reefs near the south end of the bay. So the question is, how does climate influence Pacific oysters in Willapa Bay? As I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about oyster spat and seed, and then I'm going to talk about condition index records, which are still being collected for a long period of time to presence. And a little bit about gametogenesis and spawning, but only as reflected in adults in condition. And I'm not going to talk about the last topic, but there are also records in Jennifer's working on natural larval settlement, which is also influenced by climate. So experiments that Jennifer and colleagues have done have involved putting oysters on small oysters, spat on either having them settled in a hatchery, gluing them on, as we're doing recently, putting them on plates like this, and then following growth over time here at 2 different heights off the bottom, and planting them at different locations in the bay. Go faster than this. But really important results from that original work, actually. What do I do to get out of here? What do I need to do here? I should know, escape probably. No? Yeah. Okay, so those, bad one. So these are the important results. So here are the stations where the tiles were planted out, put out of juvenile oysters up and down Willapa Bay on the coast. And here are those locations, and I've circled the ones that are out near the mouth of the estuary and ones down near the southern estuary here. And look at the bottom graph here first. So, and here we have tidal elevation, which is really important as well on this axis, and how fast those oysters grow on this axis in millimeters per month. And you'll see that there is, at least for these juvenile oysters, there's a big growth gradient at low tidal elevation, but as you get up to higher tidal elevation, that gradient's not as big. There's not as big a difference here at higher tidal elevation. And then this represents planting of those juvenile oysters on and off the bottom up here. Again, growth on this side, tidal elevation here. And if the juveniles, the seed, the ones planted on the tiles are up here in the upper part of this graph. And you, again, can see a big difference that if you are at lower tidal elevation and how there's a big difference in if you're off bottom or on bottom.
with faster growth off bottom. But if you're up at a higher tide elevation, that difference is not as big. And for 1-year-old oysters, and we just did this one experiment right off the lab and caught us, so it might be biased a little bit by that. There's not near as big a difference if you're off bottom or on bottom. And then in that publication, Jennifer also related this by doing stable isotope data on that and realized that so enriched marine phytoplankton sources, presumably all lumped over here for these stations here, and less enriched down here, all lumped over here. And so that sort of implied that these were being fed by coastal ocean circulation, and I'm not sure as much about what's going on down here, I think. And we had one outlier up here, which was also further up the estuary, but on that half of the estuary. So we've had more questions recently about do other things modify that? What goes on? Does seagrass, as an example, modify local water chemistry via photosynthesis, and does it ameliorate estuarine growing conditions for those oysters? And do other factors like where genetic factors, where the seed source was, planting height, which I already talked about, and especially estuary location, alter that response inside and outside of the eelgrass. There you go again. So these are the results of more recent work by Alex Lowe here that are about planting, and he did native oysters as well, so this is just for Pacific oysters. Planted oyster seed inside and outside of eelgrass. And so those are represented here, and found that Pacific oyster seed grew faster near the estuary mouth. So you had 3 locations along that same gradient from the river to the ocean, and found that there was a difference out near the mouth, inside and outside of eelgrass, but not so further up the estuary. But more interesting as well, seed survival was lower closer to the ocean. Another thing that the growers probably have also recognized, probably due to predation, but we're not sure, and other factors, than it was near the up at the station further up closer to the river. And we've been repeating some of those experiments, and I'm not going to talk very much, but we've got basically the same pattern. Here we had some difficulty with oyster survival at Stackpole, so we didn't get any results from there, but off of Bay Center we got fairly similar results with growth again from the now switched from the river over here and the ocean over here. And I'm just going to note this, that there's lots of other factors out there. So on a plate like this, you get lots of fouling, and that fouling, unless you scrape it off like we have here, also influences how fast they grow, as do the other oysters. So if you're monitoring late in the season, this axis represents how many oysters were left on the plot. We saw a gradient, so they crowded each other out, which the growers have known as well for a period of time. You get less survival. You have to take that into account. So now I'm going to talk about older oysters and oyster condition index, which is a measure of the body weight or the meat weight over the volume of the shell cavity. And that shell cavity is measured by several different ways, but the way we currently do it is wet weight of the whole oyster minus the shell weight of the oyster. And this is a skinny oyster, and then there are some fat oysters here. So if I say skinny, for those of who don't know, that means they have a low conditioning. And the value of this is really that my predecessors, and then me, and now Zach after me, and others have been collecting these for a long period of time. So it's really valuable data in that respect. And so for a period, they also collected that up and down the estuary from 1969 to 1978 at multiple stations, and collected that same data. And so I plotted that data here just to show that location is important for condition index as well. So again, this is sort of the fattening line that we talked about. So all these 3 stations up here are up at the top of this graph. The oysters are always fatter in oyster condition up here. They have a seasonal cycle, but they're always fatter up here at Stackpole, and not so down at the south end, although they can be almost as fat and then I'll talk about this in just a minute. They spawn down at this end, and condition index drops. So off the lab here, parcel A, it drops pretty rapidly. And they have lower condition until they fatten up again next summer. And the growers have known about that for a long time. And that reflects that reproductive condition. So here's the long-term record and the value of the long-term record. And so when I was working at the lab, we were really concerned because the value was dropping over time and had continued to drop. And then since about 1997 or thereabouts, so it fluctuates from year to year, but the long-term trend has declined, and then it has increased recently. And it's done that at all three stations. Still get a fatter oyster up here at Stack Bowl, not so down at parcel A. So that's interesting. So what's causing that? And so I'm not going to really answer that question because I need some more collaborators to work with me on this and do some of the modeling. We could do that entirely, but I am going to tell you that that the ocean is definitely, the nearshore coastal ocean is definitely driven by things like these teleconnections in the eastern North Pacific. And I'm not the first that's looked at this actually. So El Nino Southern Oscillation and Pacific Decadal Oscillation that influence that. So again, here are El Nino Southern Oscillation events, sort of marked in red here, and here's condition index. So La Ninas would be up here on top, and El Nino warmer events on the bottom here. And you can see some little points where they are similar, but it's not a real clear relationship just there, just visually. So I'm just going to talk about this visually for the most part. That's where I need collaboration. And here's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation where it's actually better. So you have cool years and they go for long periods, and you have, it oscillates again, but on the majority of cool years, you have better, fatter oysters, at least at starting point up near the mouth. And then warm years, we have lousy oyster condition. And that pretty much worked up until this last period when we had lots of reversals, and we had things where in the last few years we've had really pretty warm years and good oyster condition as well. So I'm not sure what's going on there. So now I've taken those, and it used to be we took the whole year. Well, oysters don't work on our calendar here. They're spawning every summer. We saw that seasonal cycle. So instead I've separated out now winter and spring, and then summer months here. And they're fairly similar, but you see lots more fluctuations, especially in the summer off the Nakata. And it turns out that that actually relates even better if you take the summer year to Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And that is shown here in the only analysis I've done, which is just a simple regression analysis, which shows the R squared with the PDO. And here's the winter months and summer months. And we got a much stronger correlation at both locations, but particularly at Nakata with the summer, averaging the summer months. And this is just a suggestion that maybe that bad correlation near the end was due to warming events and related to food and temperature and things like that, and not the PDO when we've seen reversals in the last few years. So it's just a plea for more work. I just want to go back to the metagenesis and spawning to finish this out, and that is that these oysters typically spawn more down here. Growers have known this as well, of course, and they spawn and sometimes set down at the southern end of the bay. So that's these sharp drops in the summer at the southern end, and not quite as sharp drops at the northern end up here, up the estuary. So I separated those out and looked at the cool phase of the PDO and warm phase of the PDO in this graph here, and years when they didn't spawn and when they did spawn, and not much difference during the cool phase of the PDO, but during the warm phase of the PDO, really big differences, and you can really see the spawning event. And actually this one line right here, that's this year, the huge oysters spawn and set in Willapa Bay. Jack's telling me one of the lowest conditions on the record, or fairly close, down at the south end of the bay, and that's because the oysters spawned. Even at Stack. So that's it for the most part. Some conclusions and outstanding questions, lots of text here, but context is important for Willapa Bay, our coastal estuaries here, both Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor. Both juvenile oyster growth and older oyster condition in U.S. Pacific Northwest coastal estuaries clearly linked to conditions in the nearshore California current ecosystem, and therefore also to larger climatic teleconnections like the PDO. And I'd like some more help looking at that. In estuary trends and a fatness line have been recognized by some of the growers in this audience for a long period of time. Oysters grow quicker, are fatter, and spawn less frequently near the estuary mouth. That's also a feature, and Jennifer, I hope we'll talk a little bit more about this, of estuarine topography and physical tidal forcing. And there may be also be local competition in the stuff that Thomas was talking about. I didn't talk too much about that, but they clearly compete with one another, oysters and other filter feeders. And though some work has been done, there are some outstanding questions, including linking phytoplankton species, instead of just looking at chlorophyll, phytoplankton species blooms and composition to those indices, and clarifying the effects of suspended sediment and the diatoms, benthic diatoms that were already mentioned to play into that. The eelgrass may affect growth of oyster seed, but it depends on location, and we suspect this is due to currents and their effect on flow and food supply, and perhaps on settlement of other competitors, as I mentioned, barnacles and other things, and not so much on water temperature or water chemistry, but data still needs to be collected, and we're still doing that on those parameters. And long-term trends are difficult to predict, but warming seas and more acidic water can't be good and are likely to change those estuarine gradients. But we do have tools for monitoring that, and I'm hoping to utilize those and get collaboration to do that in this study. And I don't have any data on Grace Harbor. On that, on oysters. Grace Harbor.